Okay, hi everyone. It's Pojo. The new cards are in draft right now. Uncommons and uncommons are in the curated packs. So we're going to be doing first impressions, and I'm just going to be recording them as I see the cards. First off, we have Aspirant's Robes, which is 1/1 summon and create and draw cultists. Spellcraft 4 play patience, which seems pretty sweet. Like I think that overall that's just going to be really interesting in terms of just limited mechanics. It's pretty fun. So you've got the unit that gets a little bit bigger and gets Overtorch. You have the cultist, which is a little bit of an addition as well. I think that like the stats for this are effectively, it's 2/2 of stats for one, and it's divided in a way that's actually really, really good for your deck. I think this might even be playable in ranked for that reason. Spellcraft 4 play patience is obviously a very expensive patience, since that's one extra to every card in your opponent's hand. But if you get this nice and early with like some ramp, that doesn't feel terrible. And really the disruptive element of it is pretty interesting as a like sort of bonus for what is otherwise a pretty aggressive card. I think it's a interesting use of spellcraft. Could actually be good in a ranked environment, though hard to say for sure. The Evangels, I love them. They have double influence, but fate gain influence, charge. That's so cool. And yeah, like this is a really delightful card. I'm so glad to see Fate come back. I think these are really interesting fixers that create some interesting situations where you can actually like get them in, and basically they will make time for you in decks that like maybe need to get time. You can't play them off of their own Fate abilities, but you can get like a ton of time very, very quickly, which means that you can do some interesting monocolored stuff, some interesting like Xenon or like double faction stuff basically. And yeah, they could be really interesting in terms of gameplay value. 2/2 charge is definitely not a bad deal. This thing is effectively a raid leader, or what is it? There's a 2/2 in red that does this, but this is like a pretty decent option. So yeah, I'm pretty cool with this. This is a really interesting option, and like giving it like echo or redrawing it multiple times. There's a lot of interesting ways to sort of build up influence with this card, which seems super strong to me. Like actually one of the things that might be interesting is Timekeeper decks in Pauper with Grodov Evangel and like Trailmaker, things like Strangers. You can now accumulate time in so many different ways that like you can actually get a ton of time very quickly and then get like a very, very large Timekeeper, or better yet, a very, very large Flashfire, which would be pretty wild. Okay, Relentless Combatant. Berserk with Mastery 8, 2+2+2. I think this one got spoiled already, but it's pretty decent. It's pretty hard to get them. I think the two skills are at odds with each other. Like, you have to get the Mastery to make the Berserk worth it. If you use the Berserk, you won't get the Mastery. So, like, but on the other hand, the Berserk does feed into the Mastery a little bit. All the same, I think this card's understated. I'm not super fond of it in limited formats, but, like, if you got the right buffs for it, then sure, it might actually be the right card to pick. Wilderness Refuge. +1 maximum power, which is a lot on 3, and Spellcraft 3 play Lost in the Mist. The 6 on it is pretty interesting, but I think either side of this, when you're playing it for 3 for +1, or you're playing it for 6 for +1, and you sort of disrupt your opponent's board, either way, I think you're not getting great value out of this. The Spellcraft is more interesting than the other option, at least, so both modes are a little bit weak, but potentially this card could get you into places that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get into. It does shut off very big draft threats, which is really interesting. Rainfall Accord, draw 2 cards and discard a card as a fast spell. Man, that's not bad, actually. Like, I would say that this is pretty reasonable. It's a little overcosted, but as a fast spell, that's definitely an interesting alternative to Wisdom of the Elders at the same cost. I don't know, it's a little bit weird, but potentially does get you some interesting value, and if you got some good discard synergy, this card's just fine. Like, it's a really neat trick that you can use to make discard synergy happen, and there seems to be quite a bit of it in the format, so yeah, it's good stuff. Grodov's Favored, 6 cost, 6/5. Summon, you may silence another unit. Big old giant, which is interesting. Like, it's interesting that we just had Ruin or Melt printed, something like that, where you can break down Sentinels, and then ever since that card has been printed, there's just been no large Sentinels, which drives me nuts in limited formats, but hey, okay, sure. In any case, this is another big, giant limited card that actually has some pretty good strength to it. I think this card's really strong in limited, honestly. Like, this is something that gives you, like, the big worm stats. It's big enough to deal with basically everything except the 7/7s, which, admittedly, there are a few 7/7s. If the curated packs continue to contain worm Stone or other like very large drops with 7 health, then this card's not as strong. But overall, this is a really good option because it gives you that silence, which shuts off a flyer, and then you have the big board with your time cards. That seems really, really good. Anything else here? Breath of Voprex. Deal 5 damage to an enemy unit unless the enemy player has Breath of Voprex. Deal 5 damage to them instead. Okay, choice cards are not typically great, but this card does deal an absurd amount of damage in a very short period of time, so it's definitely not unreasonable in terms of like the overall stats per value that you're getting. The problem is that either you're playing a deck that really wants to burn your opponent's face for intense amounts of damages, or you are playing a deck that wants the removal, needs the removal, has to have the removal. I would say a lot of the time, like, because 5 damage is so much for 2, it might actually be worth it to like soak the enemy unit. I think the numbers on this are at least right, even if choice cards, enemy choice cards, are typically very bad and don't actually have a lot of value to them. Still, it's interesting. Xultan Paladin's just a 3-2 for 2. This is actually effectively a reprint, except that it's a paladin instead of a soldier. It's a new Argenport soldier, but being a paladin does make paladin synergy a lot better, and paladins are pretty good right now, so there's no reason not to like it. Sand Strong, give a unit +3/+3 and Exalted this turn. I believe they talked about how Finest Hour Exalted definitely works because you can just like set that up, but now you have Finest Hour with Exalted, so Stand Strong will allow you to trade with a very, very large unit and then get a very, very large weapon out of it. That's super good. There's not really much wrong with that as a limited trick. It's still a little slow for a spell in any sort of like ranked format, but I would say that for the most part, like, you're getting pretty good value out of that, so it's probably worth playing. Might even be better than Finest Hours in some scenarios in ranked, which seems pretty cool. We already seen Ardent Convert. That card's sweet. Same with Reconnaissance. Both really interesting options. Ardent Convert is particularly fun, so good stuff. Alright, Makar Evangel, quick draw, 2 cost with Fate Gain Shadow. 2-2 with quick draws, bare minimum goodness. Like, this was definitely not bad for something that effectively has 1 shadow influence, but like, yeah, overall I'm not super excited about something that only has quick draw when you have like quick draw Warcry, quick draw other stuff going on. Nonetheless, a fine draft card because it's got evasion on a 2-drop. Quick draw on a shadow card this early is really interesting and limited. Should change up the limited format quite a bit because this card is just very strong there. Linray Evangel has Overwhelm, which means that you can do some really interesting things with it. It's also a Yeti, which is pretty important. All of these cards are clerics, it appears, which is sweet. This card fixes for a lot of like deep blue options, which is really interesting if you want to do like spell damage with Cloud Snake Carrier, or like play with some like pretty aggressive stuff, like maybe even like Sodi or something along those lines. There's some interesting things that you can do with it. Overall, this seems like the weakest of the 3 that I've seen so far, but the Overwhelm ability does synergize very well with like green buffs in limited formats, so something to keep an eye out for if you're playing like time into other shenanigans. Makar's Bloodwolf has Lifesteal on a 2-3. That's pretty good as a limited option. The Mastery is also quite decent, but like, yeah, this card's not going to make it in ranked. It's just way too expensive. Still, wow, that's sweet art. What a neat looking wolf. There's a lot of interesting things going on with it. Like, there's that like cool goop coming up and sort of like, yeah, it's emanating off of it or coming up into it. Either way, it's kind of pretty cool to see. All right, Calamity Oracle. When you play a curse, the enemy player discards the top 5 cards of their deck. So yeah, like, we have some interesting things going on there. Like, the stat line is not great for a 3-drop. The curse ability means that you're playing synergy with something that's not amazing most of the time to get mill, which is also not amazing most of the time. There is a curse that specifically allows for mill to happen with Calamity Oracle, so that's okay, but overall I'm not super psyched about this. I like it a little better than the 0-4 with the constant empower effect, but I actually think the 0-4 is a little stronger as far as mill cards go. Also, still seeing a lot of mill cards, not super happy about that. Xenon Insignia has a new alt art, which like, this is actually a lot prettier than the standard Insignia. This is something that's just sort of like in the middle and like doing some interesting things. I like how the diamond kind of has teeth in this one. Typically the Xenon Insignia has never been all that interesting, but this version of it is actually kind of barbed and sharp and has some cool stuff going on, which, yeah, that's pretty sweet. Brutish Interloper, 3-cost, 2-4, and Reckless. Mastery 6, +1/+1, and Overwhelm. Mastery 12, +3/+3, and Berserk. So getting Berserk at the end of a mastery is much more interesting than getting Berserk at the beginning of one. This card is Reckless, which is definitely going to limit its options in ranked formats because it's just a little bit understated already, and the mastery ability, while strong-ish, is not going to be like amazing at 6. It's going to be a lot better at 12. This card wins games in limited just because it's like pretty aggressive, pretty hard to get around. You play it with a decent amount of removal and it slowly takes over the game. That's the kind of like mastery play that you want to see, and certainly seems interesting. I feel like this card's going to die pretty frequently, even in mastery formats. If the curated packs continue to contain Defiance, then this card is a lot worse. But if they don't, and if it's like not really an isolate setup or anything like that, you have like instead the green option that gives you kills on things with no skills or something like that, then yeah, like the less removal that's available for Brutish Interloper, the better Brutish Interloper is. Overall, it seems a little bit weak, but potentially could take over a game in limited and could be actually quite devastating in limited, maybe even a very high pick depending on what the removal situation is. Razor Wire Totemite. Hey, we got another Totemite. This one has Exalted and Quick Draw, which I think Totemites with Exalted are probably going to be a thing just because they kind of have this sort of sacrifice ability. It's weird that Red has yet another extremely cute, extremely wonderful, like new type of card. Like these are effectively Grenadin again, but they're not Grenadin, they're Totemites, which I'm okay with that. These guys are adorable. I actually like them a little better than Grenadin. They're just so adorably round. It's a pretty good thing. All right, it's time for like Grenadin Totemite fights. Let's go. Seems awesome. All right, 4 on the top here. Unkindness. At the end of the cursed player's turn, so we do have a cursed relic here for 2. If they didn't play a unit, sacrifice Unkindness to play an Unkindness of Ravens. 3/1/1 Ravens with flying. That's cute. That's a good idea. To like sort of, it's a cute play on words where basically you have like, yeah, I think there's a lot of that going on with Eternal sometimes where they get really, really cute with the wordplay. But yeah, like an Unkindness of Ravens seems neat. 3/1/1 Ravens with flying is a pretty good deal. This is a lot easier to pull off than something like Secret Weapon, which has just like way too many card requirements, and every time they play units it just gets further and further away from you. Unkindness will always go off eventually and is 2 for 3 flying ravens, which is pretty decent in any sort of format where you are trying to do tokens. It's also a curse, which means that you can get some pretty good curse benefits from it, and it plays pretty well with Xenon Obelisk, any sort of like totem-based effects. You could actually do like a Xenon take turns deck with just a bunch of token generation, sort of like Witching Hour with red, purple, and yellow, and like just totally rock it with Unkindness and a bunch of other options. Fill your whole board, use Clock of Stolen Hours, Furious Compulsion, maybe. Yeah, there's certainly some options. Rally, lots of things that could make like 3 flying ravens is just a pretty big deal that early on. Humbug Swarm costs 6. So like if this card goes off at all, then your opponent's just in a lot of trouble. And also Shadow has access to a lot of the discard. You can use Fallen Oni. You can use a Treachery to toss units out of your opponent's hand. You can make Unkindness go off a little bit faster and then support those ravens. I think this card is viable in ranked. It's pretty nuts in draft. Like they are going to be playing a lot more units in draft for the most part. Like the base is probably 20 for a good deck. So there are situations where you just kind of skip your 2-drop here, but I mean, at any point where your opponent can't play a unit, then suddenly they have 3/1/1 flyers to deal with. That's a really big deal. I think this card's very strong. We're actually going to take this card, actually. But first things first, Cult Recruiter, Ambush, Mastery 4 +1/+1. Not bad, considering that it can get its Mastery very, very early thanks to the Ambush. You knock out a 2/2 with this and attack in, you get a 4/4, which 4/4 for 4, not that great, but an Ambush 3/3 for 4 is pretty good, so I don't see any reason to say that this card is bad. Like, it's definitely solid removal and also like a decent option in like pretty much any limited format. This card's pretty good. Pick it highly. Gaudy Showman. Summon, exhaust an enemy unit. Okay. 1/4 is not a stat line that I like to see on a 3-drop. Even like a 5/1 is not that great. But yeah, like Oni Rogue is interesting. I'm curious if there's ever going to be any Rogue synergy. I love the art on this card, but overall I'm not too impressed with its general effectiveness. It does have that on-hit exhaust, which is definitely a thing that can be used to sort of toss in a lot of extra damage in places you wouldn't otherwise be able to get it. It does synergize pretty well with itself, but at the same time, turn, like, you're leaving a lot on board. I don't know that this card is terribly strong. There's too many 1 damage removal spells, and like it's just not fast enough to really get you the sort of value that you want. Prancing Griffin, flying, summon, you give another flying unit flying this turn. That's a really good effect on a 1/1. 1/1 flyers are traditionally not amazingly strong, but this is one of the stronger ones that you can pick. The ability to just knock out like 6 or 7 damage with a single flyer, definitely not bad if you're playing something like Combre Big Stuff in Limited. I don't know if it's going to be solid in Ranked, but even there, I'm not really opposed to the idea of a 1-drop that eventually puts you into like serious damage mode and also enables all of your infiltrates. So you can play this with Feln or like do Argent Feln now with Lethrai Infiltrator and other shenanigans. There's some interesting stuff to be doing with that. I don't know if it's a super strong Ranked card, but draft-wise, it seems like a really high pick. Assuming that you've got the right kind of deck for it. Numbing Cold. When the cursed player plays a spell, sacrifice Numbing Cold to negate it. Instantly locks down your opponent's next spell. Not awful for a curse if you're looking for curse synergy. If you're not looking for curse synergy, it's definitely a pass. Metal. Give one of your units invulnerable to damage this turn. This was a 2-drop with, I think, Warp previously. This is definitely not a bad combat trick and could be pretty reasonable. Like, considering how cheap it is, I don't think it's terrible. You certainly don't get a lot of value out of it because your opponent's, it only works in a trade situation where your opponent has to decide to trade with your card. But overall, this seems like a really reasonable option that shuts off like torches and any sort of like red burn. I don't think this is terrible. I'm not sure if it's amazing and limited, but you could definitely do some interesting things with it. Crowd Quieter, 3-cost 2/1, play a flash grenade. Nothing wrong with that. It's cheap removal and limited, and then the spellcraft is also okay because you can. Oh, it's Crowd Queller. I don't know why I said Quieter. Same meaning at least. Yeah. So like, I think the 3-cost version of this is decent. Like, it's decent removal. Flash grenade is not an amazing thing to play at slow speed for the most part. Like, you're mostly just going to pick up 1 extra point of damage, so that kind of limits its usefulness, especially since you have to pay 6 for it. That's a lot of stats for what you want to do, but I don't mind the 3-cost half of it. It is cheap removal and limited. You can do some decent stuff with that, so not too bad. The art of insignias is very good. Yeti Griffin Rider. Oh, I feel like some opportunities were missed with the art on this one. Like, this is not that funny looking a card, but it's such a funny idea. Yeah, like, they need to redo the art on this one. There's a lot of problems with it. It's just kind of like really serious for something that is very like dumb and silly. Flying Berserk 1/1, Mastery 3 +1/+1. So pretty expensive for your Mastery ability, but if you put like a heavy axe on it, you have something that you're pretty satisfied with. You have to boost the Mastery on this to get the right type of value, but overall this seems reasonably strong. So not unreasonable and limited, pretty bad in Ranked. Torture. The cursed unit has -4, -1. That's a rough card. Not a bad curse overall for limited formats. It's kind of decent removal in general. Leaves the unit around, which is usually not something you want, but yeah, I would say that it's not going to really play much in Ranked, but definitely seems like a solid choice in a limited format because you can just basically toss a unit away. The main problem is that it then still allows itself as a blocker, so if you're playing a pretty aggressive deck, which you usually are, this is not going to do a whole heck of a lot. At least it can kill 1 health units without any issues, which may actually be its use most of the time, but still, enabling something that's like relatively large to become just completely useless, not awful. Overall, I'm pretty lukewarm on it. Chant to Grodov. Each unit in your hand gets +1/+1 on Overwhelm. That's definitely not a bad rally, but also each unit in your hand is a pretty weird spell text, even at 2. I don't think it's awful, but I also don't think it's amazing. There are some interesting things you can do with this. I would really love to play it in a deck where you are trying to set up Overwhelm on Joral Frostkin early on, so that you can do some sort of interesting shenanigan combo. But yeah, like, it also is a 2-cost spell, so not going to do an amazing amount of stuff. This is similar to the +4/+4 and Endurance option. There may be some interesting niche uses for it, and it might even be strong and limited as well, but overall it leaves a little to be desired. Here we have Blood of Makar. When one of your units hits the cursed player, it gets +2 strength. Yeah, like this is pretty interesting. Not a bad cursed relic. Like the ability on it is decently strong. It's kind of like a bad version of Paladin Oathbook, but at the same time, if you're playing a bunch of interesting flyers, if you're playing, say, for example, a Unkindness of Ravens, then like this is something that gets you a lot of value out very, very quickly in a curse-based deck. I think this is one of the stronger curses that you can play in Unseen Curses, just from what I've seen so far. Seems quite decent. Fervent Siphoner, Exalted. When the player discards the card, Fervent Siphoner gets +1 strength this turn. So the more cards you can make somebody discard on the turn that you exalt this card, the more damage you get on the weapon, which is interesting. Pretty hard to force players to discard cards most of the time, but you do have a lot of like self-mill stuff going on. And this actually gives mill some interesting teeth, which I think is pretty important. So yeah, seems like a reasonable option. Definitely something that you can do to make mill a little bit more interesting, and it's a little bit better than like it's a little bit more interactive than Black Iron Manacles, so I'm on board with this brand of mill. This is definitely a kind of card that I think is worth printing and seems like pretty interesting. Note that that ability doesn't get transferred with Exalted, it's only battle skills, so something to remember. But overall, seems interesting. Let's take a look. 4-cost +2/+2. When the wielder hits the enemy player, create and draw a 2/2 Oni Grunt. Kind of similar to Copperhull Cudgel, but also like probably a bit stronger. The Oni Grunt, of course, doesn't have any skills, so nothing too crazy happening there. But nonetheless, this turns basically any flyer into a drone dropper, or even a little bit better than a drone dropper. So it's a wild card for flyers. I'd pick this pretty highly, especially in Skycrag or Rakano flyers. Like you can do some pretty wild stuff with it. Seems pretty interesting. Overall, very strong card, at least in limited. In ranked, no, not really. Here, Swaying Sea Curin, muster, create, and draw a 1/1 humbug with flying. That's not a bad stat line for what you've got with the muster. Like if you're playing spellcraft units on this, you're probably pretty happy and limited. The muster ability is not amazingly strong, but overall the stat line's there. I think it's a little bit too weak for ranked, but this one could be a bit of a sleeper just because that 4 health is pretty reasonable on a 3-drop. Overall, not too bad. Definitely carries weapons pretty well, and that's important for anything with muster. This is one of the stronger muster cards that I've seen so far. Icy Gaze, stun an enemy unit, and if you have blue influence and you discard Icy Gaze, play it from your void. So it looks like there's a cycle of these cards. That is really interesting. Potentially some really good options with that, and also this synergizes really well with that 3-cost draw 2 discard 1, which means that you can actually do some pretty wild things if you're playing a bunch of Icy Gazes and a bunch of draw 2 discard 1. Seems cool. This definitely enables that sort of madness effect that you want to do, so I'm pretty down with it. I think this probably plays in both ranked and limited depending on what type of deck you're running. It's much harder to, you have to really like build around it in ranked, but yeah, stunning enemy units is a reasonable thing to do for free, so not at all bad. Seems pretty strong. Zoltan Brushfang. It's a 1/2 with Mastery 2 Deadly, Mastery 4 +3/+3. Hard to get this card across, but like reasonable stat line for a 1-cost. Reasonable stat line for that Mastery. Mastery 4 would be ridiculous because this card can just push and push and push. I think this card's quite a good limited pick and may even be decent enough in ranked just because Mastery has some reasonable synergies that you can play with that'll actually leave you a decent deadly unit. That being said, it never goes a card up. It's always just a 1-drop that turns into something bigger, but you can get a pretty big unit out of this if you're playing weapons on it, so not at all bad for a first thing to put weapons on. Seems quite interesting. Greed's Reward. Wait, Greed's Reward. Deal 1 damage to an enemy. Draw a card for each damage Greed's Reward dealt. Nice to see this card back. Interesting to see it back in blue, seeing as it's already back in blue in the form of Maul. But yeah, if you didn't know, Greed's Reward used to be a red card that was 6, deal 2 damage to an enemy for each spell they have, or for each card they have in their hand, which, yeah, it was effectively the text of Maul. So yeah, we get a extra point of damage for each damage Greed's Reward dealt. You do have to decimate for it, which is a pretty big deal, but yeah, kind of interesting. So the art of the card is still the Greed's Reward art, but also like you are getting an actual reward for being greedy. So That's curious. But yeah, if you get a lot of spell damage and you decimate, you can get a ton of cards out of this and also kill a unit, so it gets more and more channel-like the further along you go. Overall, not too bad in a ranked format. I would struggle to find it being good in limited, but Lens of Clarity is currently available in the curated packs. Assumably, lots of spell damage will be available in the curated packs and in the main packs, so could potentially be quite strong if you got the right cards for it. Definitely a sleeper pick if you are, like, if you're high on synergy, definitely worth picking up. Flamekeeper, Exalted Overwhelm, you have Overwhelm. That's a pretty good deal. Like, basically that is the equivalent of a Stone Scar Maul, so it gives all of your spells Overwhelm, on top of giving you Overwhelm. Which, yeah, the unit is pretty limited in its overall setup, but if you're playing decent spell damage, you can do some interesting options with it. Shavka Evangel has Berserk, which, of the Evangels, that's a pretty strong skill overall on a 2-2. Especially if you're playing in like mastery decks with lots of pump spells. Like, this is something that makes Daring Maneuver look pretty ridiculous. Overall, not bad for a red option, and a good like swap on aggression. I really like that the time one has Charge and the red one has Berserk, because both of those are things that can shift from setup to setup. Mountain Goliath, while it's in your hand, it gets +2/+2 each time you draw another unit. That card is actually really reasonable. I don't know if it's going to be ranked viable, but it is an enormous 7-drop that will usually end up being like something along the lines of an 8/8 to a 10/10, occasionally even bigger than that. Seems really cool. You got to give it Overwhelm, but overall pretty fun to grab, so certainly not bad. And there are a lot of cards that actually allow you to draw more units, so you can make this into an enormous card pretty quickly. And even set up like an 8-drop Savagery kill in Elysian if you're playing lots and lots of drawable tokens. Could be fun. Rent Seeker, Mastery 6, play Curse of Taxation on the enemy player. What an extremely irritating paladin. Not really good, very poorly statted. The Mastery is so obnoxious that people are going to deal with this card when it comes out. Stat line's bad for a 4-drop. And Curse of Taxation is not that powerful of a curse, but if you're doing it with Decimates, can certainly be very, very irritating. I don't know why they printed this card. This is just garbage in all forms. It's really, really griefy. It's not good. It just feels like a trap for griefers to be unhappy with themselves. Sunset Priest. Each player discards the top 3 cards of their deck. A reasonable option on a 3/3. Actually, that's very good. You can get some good discard synergies out of it. It's just a decently powerful 3-drop, which is always good and limited. It's an elf, which is important, and it has its own self-mill. You can play this in ranked elf on the shelf. Like, that's a real thing, so definitely seems like a good card. Funeral Pyre. Deal 2 damage to an enemy, decimate, deal 2 damage to an additional enemy. As a fast spell, this card's strong. The decimate ability is something that you don't want to pay for all the time, but frequently you'll just be using this to like knock off a 3/2 or a 2/3 or something along those lines, and if that happens, you feel pretty happy. This is definitely not unreasonable. If you get the decimate, then you probably don't mind losing the power, and also you got a 2-for-1, so seems like a decent deal. Generally, fast spells that deal damage are quite a bit stronger than they look. This one doesn't kill a lot of things, but it's still reasonably strong and definitely gets you some good benefits, both a limited and a ranked viable card, I think. Storm of Feathers, stun 2 enemy units, decimate, you gain 4 armor. What a bad decimate. Like, this could be reasonable. I guess, like, if you want the decimate for any reason, then cool. Slow spell 2 stun is not awful in green. Like, certainly it's nice to have that kind of aggression attached to it on a limited mechanic. That decimate is baffling. I really don't know what you want to use it for. Obviously, it does come in handy. Like, it's just not a card that you can plan for or effectively use, except in situations where you basically have to use it. The art's really sweet, though. Like, really sweet. Immortalize, draw a unit from your void, decimate, it gets exalted. That's really cute. It provides you with a recursion that also gets additional recursion if you decimate. This is one of the first cards that we've seen that actually draws a unit back from your void apart from Dark Return, so there's some possible ranked viability for it just because there's a lot of reasonable options to sort of get draw happening. It is a fast spell, so you get your unit back when you need it, and then you also get to possibly make it exalted. Overall, I think this card is very strong in ranked, and maybe less strong in limited, just because the recursion is not as important in this format as is, and decimate is feeling a bit more like a ranked format setup. Still, this is interesting and potentially could be quite powerful. Eager Offering. At the start of your turn, sacrifice to draw 2 cards. Not really the strongest Wisdom of the Elders that I've ever seen, but it does fill your void with units and also function as removal in some other situations. Can draw removal away from your opponent while like essentially allowing them to spend it to prevent you from drawing cards. Overall, tricky setup, but maybe could be good. You can also do some stuff like play this with the Exhaust abilities, Back for More, and Remembrance. You can play it with, what else? I mean, Remembrance is definitely serious recursion. This card is stronger than it looks in Ranked, and it's decently powerful in Draft because you can play it down, block a unit, draw some cards, solid stall, seems quite good. Overall, I'd pick it pretty highly. Alright, found a new one. Proselytize. Pay 2 1/1 cultists. Decimate, create, and draw 2 additional 1/1 cultists. So, similar to Search Party in that it plays 2 cultists, or plays 2 1/1s, and like that kind of value can be pretty useful. The Decimate ability is pretty weak in my opinion. Like, you are drawing the cultists, you aren't playing them, so you don't get 4, but notably does synergize really well with some like Praxis token styles and some Xenon token styles. So if you wanted to play this with Vault of the Praxis or Xenon Obelisk, that could be really, really interesting. Yeah, I'm definitely pretty on board with this. It's decent, but like the Decimate is a little bit weird. Seems like a reasonable limited bomb if you got the right stuff. We're running 2 Stonecar Outfitters right now, so this seems like the appropriate pickup. But yeah, good stuff. Snowstorm Druid. Summon, you gain an Aegis. Okay, not bad on a 1/1. Muster, stun an enemy unit. So yeah, really good overall. You got a good summon effect on a small 1/1 flyer. You have a muster ability that matters and can be repeated over and over again every time you spellcraft. I think this card's very good and possibly even viable in Ranked. Flyers carry weapons pretty well. This is just a really decent flyer. Does some good stuff. Alright, Befoul, sacrifice 2 units to play a 7/6 Bane Wolf. If there are 10 or more cards in the enemy void, play an additional Bane Wolf. If you get both Bane Wolves, this card is insane for value. The 7/6s have Mastery 7 unblockable. For some reason that's not showing up on this card, but nonetheless, it's pretty ridiculous. Yeah, it's a very, very strong limited card. It's not even all that unreasonable in Ranked, but I would say that overall sacrificing 2 units is a pretty deep cost, and since this is not a fast spell or anything along those lines, it's not amazing in some situations like that. But hey, you're playing a bunch of little tokens, you convert them into giant, enormous nonsense monsters, then yeah, it's going to be a little bit weirder. Alright, those were all first impressions with cards. I was genuinely impressed with quite a few of them, and we had some pretty good drafts with it. Actually got ourselves into top 10 in draft playing with those cards, just generally following our instincts and opting for good synergies with what we thought was good. The 6/5 giant with the silence effect was definitely one of the strongest cards that we found. We did get Unkindness of Ravens in combination with the Cursed Relic that gave +2 attack, and that was also ridiculous. Ended up with a 7/0, a 7/1, and a 7/2, and yeah, felt pretty happy about it. So yeah, these cards are pretty exciting. The limited format is really, really fun. I really enjoyed Mastery. Like, Mastery was just a really fine mechanic, and I even had some fun with Decimate in limited. Like, it seemed like a pretty reasonable option some of the time. Wasn't all that hard a choice to make most of the time, and actually ended up being pretty useful. So yeah, the new mechanics are fun. Flame of Xulta is looking amazing. We also got a chance to play with the new Ranked card, which is available now in the pre-order bundle. We will have some stuff up with that tomorrow with any luck, and yeah, it's pretty fun. The deck that we made is quite delightful. I'll definitely be trying to get a video up by Saturday, so it should be pretty exciting. Thank you guys so much for watching, and cheers. I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful time playing with the new Eternal cards in draft, and I hope this little first impressions guide helped. Thanks so much.